or your arguments, because if you do go over the 3 minutes, I will have to stop you. Okay, thank you very much. The order of the agenda for this evening will be, just bear 1 second. Okay. First of all, sorry, any apologies for absences? No?
Yes, we've got those apologies there.
Okay. We've got Councillor Linda Kirby and David Ward, and Councillors David Chung and Councillor John Dehaney will be substituting. Thank you very much. Okay. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? No. Are the minutes of the last meeting, 18th of July, agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Right. On to the order of the meeting. Can make a note of this. So we will, item number 7, 101 Hamilton Road. Then item number 9, which is the land adjacent to 163A Mostyn Road. Then item number 6, 24 The Grange. Then item number 8, flat 1237 Kingston Road. And then finally item 5, 83 Dora Road. So with that, could we please start on item 7, 101 Hamilton Road?
Thank you, Chair. The application is for the erection of a 2-storey detached building with accommodation at roof level and basement level, and it comprises 13 flats. That's 5 1-bedroom, 6 2-bedroom, and 2 3-bedroom flats. The report before you goes through the history, and as you're aware, there is quite a history to this one. We have an appeal decision as well on this particular property, and that is attached to the report in front of you. Just so you're aware, there are actually no late modifications on this particular report, so you don't have to refer to those. If I take you through the photographs of the site, some will remember it from last time it was at committee. You'll be aware of this particular building, which is Rose Cottage. That was actually demolished a couple of years back, maybe a year back. That was legitimately done under the planning regulations. I know there was an issue about that, but it was ratified as being the correct method of actually doing that. And if you look at the relationship between this building and the neighbours, you'll see it was a reasonable sized building. These are the workshops at the back of the site. They've all been demolished as well, so it is now a cleared site, as you'll see in a second. This is a photograph showing the site now. And I'd note, if you want to point out the flank wall and the neighbouring property, and you'll see the report mentions flats, etc., and the neighbouring properties to the south side, and those are shown in that particular photograph there. So the site itself, as I say, it was an employment site previously. The report goes into great detail about that, and the fact the inspector never raised that as an issue in the previous refusal. So officers don't believe that's a reason that could be sustained in terms of refusal for the site. The proposal itself increases the number of flats on the site from the last proposal. I think it was 9 last time, it's now going to be 13. Some of that is due to the fact the previous proposal had if you recall, had a building on the back of the site as well. So it was a front building and a back building. The back building is now gone. That was one of the buildings that was causing quite an issue. So we now just have one building itself at basement level. And you'll see the accommodation there at basement level with cycle stores, waste, etc. And the scheme has been amended throughout the application process to make it more acceptable. And these particular basements have outdoor amenity space that's compatible with the guidelines in the London plan. And if we go up the floor, you'll see that's quite a detailed plan. Of course, you probably won't be able to see in great detail, but there are flats. And these particular flats here, it's not just the basement flats, the duplex flats. So the flats, 2 of the flats in the basement also have accommodation on the first floor as well. So they're not just stuck underground. And then we have the first floor, and what I'd do is note there the relationship with the neighbouring property here. You'll see, remember that photograph of the flank wall, which comes up to about here, 2-storey, and then this element's a single-storey element. So there's aspects of the scheme from the previous refused appeal that have been changed quite substantially, certainly in terms of overlooking. In other words, for instance, that particular balcony there, where it says balcony, it's actually a roof terrace, but it's not used as a roof terrace as such. And the screening, etc., around the roof terraces that are proposed as part of the development. So I take you up, that's the roof level, where the accommodation within the roof, I should say. And there we have the actual roof itself, which also has outdoor amenity space on the roof. So we've got the amenity space in the form of light wells at the back, actually quite large one, a stepped up area onto the, stepped up area from these light wells onto the ground floor area here, so there's actually space there. So the report goes through the amenity space for each of the units. They comply because the roof can be used by those units that don't have specific amenity space associated directly with those flats. The roof space obviously is quite a bit of amenity space, and overall it's considered to be acceptable. So if we look to there's the solar panels on the roof as well. If we look through the sections, probably don't show a huge amount, but you'll see the roof area at the top there. I think that's probably the best, and there is a sort of kitchen area and everything for the occupants when they're using the roof terrace to provide facilities on the roof area. Probably more interesting is the elevations. So here we have the front elevation, and what I do is ask you to note the neighbouring properties either side and the roof level. This has been reduced down in size, and although it's a bit complicated, again, that plan, you'll see where the previous proposal was. It was a higher roof form. This one's been made significantly squat. It was previously 4 units in a row. They've broken that elevation up now, so we have these more attractive bay elements that are actually split between the floors. So whilst it is 4 stories of accommodation in the property, from the front of the street, you will see dormer windows. It would look like 2.5. Often people call it 2.5 when you have accommodation in the roof, but it's 3 stories of accommodation there plus a basement. So in terms of the context of the street, this is considered to be acceptable in design terms. If I move forward now, you'll see the elevation facing south, and you'll see these, there's a light well that's created there. If I go back to the original, here we go, just to see the context of that light well. Obviously we have residential properties here in the flats looking over that way. These windows are pointed inwards towards each other. You can't quite see the relationship to the rear. It's about 30 metres between this and the properties in Hardy Road. You can vaguely see it on there, so there's quite a big gap here. And it's considered there's no amenity impact because of the large flank wall that I showed you on the photographs. If I just pop back to that, you'll see there, it's right up against the flank wall there. So you could argue the more sensitive side is up against these flats here. And there's gardens to the rear of next door as well that are potentially overlooked, but there is obscure glazing being proposed. The parking on the site, it's proposed that there will be, if I can find at the front, there's 2 spaces on the road that will be created that aren't there at the moment. The crossover will be taken away. In highways terms, officers recognised there was an existing use on the site. It was 10 rooms as an HMO and also office accommodation. So we have to balance the existing transport demands on the site with what's being proposed. The applicant has offered to secure a Section 106 for a car-free development apart from the 3-bedroom flats, the 2 3-bedroom flats. And on balance, officers consider that's reasonable given the existing uses on the site. Did generate traffic, did have parking on the street, etc. So it's only the 2 spaces. Obviously, the rest of the occupants of the flats will not be able to be issued with car parking permits, so there shouldn't be an issue in terms of the impact on the road. In all other respects, the application is considered to be acceptable. Probably these images give a reasonable impression in terms of the materials. And as I was saying before, in terms of the impact on the street scene, it has been reduced. You can see at the rear of the property, there is the 3-stroke and roof story as well, so it looks a little bit deeper at the back of the property. But from the front, in terms of these angles, it's not out of context in terms of what's there now already. And we have to bear in mind, of course, Rose Cottage was there. There was quite a large building at the front of the site in any event. Clearly, any redevelopment of the site will have a building at the front of the site. We'd want that urban edge at the front of the site, so we would want a building of some kind here in any event. That's just some internal design photographs, shall we say. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 objectors. Now, I believe one may be running late, so I'll ask, is Sophie Belcher here at the moment? No. In that case, could I ask Craig Duncan, are you here? Yes. 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in opposition to this proposal. So my name's Craig Duncan, and I own 97 Hamilton Road, which is one of the properties, as you've seen, directly adjacent to the proposed development. and therefore I'm one of the parties that is going to be most impacted by this proposal. When I purchased this property a year ago, I purchased it on the basis that I knew at some point there would be some development there, and going forward it will be nice to look at something beyond just a wreck of a site. However, I think that this proposed overdevelopment of the site is not something that I personally can agree with, and I know that from the volume of objections that have been raised from those in the neighbourhood, there are a number that share my views and concerns about this particular proposal. The two main objections that I would like to highlight beyond those that I've already submitted in opposition here are: one is around the extent of digging and excavation that would be required to build this property here. As is the case across London, a lot of properties are built on areas with sort of soft soil, and there's the risk of shrinkable soilage. And indeed, when I bought the property, my what's the word I'm looking for? The surveyor's report, thank you very much, was no different. And if this proposal were to be accepted, it would present a significant risk, in my opinion, through the excavation, tremors and vibrations to the structural stability of my property, as it would for others in the close vicinity as well. Whilst I know that the application does make concessions around recording and monitoring of movement, I don't feel that this significantly or substantially mitigates the risk. Monitoring and reporting are fine, but if any movement is recorded, it's too late, it's already happened, and therefore I'm the one that's going to have to suffer the consequences of that as well. The other point that I would like to highlight is particularly with this roof terrace as well, that there's going to be an invasion of my privacy in terms of my back garden. This roof terrace will be looking down over into my garden, and whilst there have been some assurances made around some sort of screening, etc., I don't feel that these will be sufficient. And if they are to be at a level which will prevent people from peering over, they are then going to result in a blockage of the sunlight into my garden, particularly during the afternoon hours as well. I think I've made my 2 points around the excavation and particularly the risk to my property and any potential consequences I may face around that, as well as the invasion of privacy. And those are the two main objections that I have. I have already submitted a number of objections in addition to that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'll ask again. Sophie Belcher? No. Right, on to the agent. Matt Richards. Mr. Richards, because Mrs. Belcher hasn't arrived, you're reduced to 3 minutes. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm Matt Richards, the planning agent for the application. Firstly, I would just note that the applicant only acquired the site last year and then therefore hasn't been involved in any of the events that have gone on the site before this. Since acquiring it, we've worked proactively with your officers at the council through pre-application discussions, and we've also incorporated officer comments throughout the consultation period post-submission as well, making amendments as necessary. The application now before you proposes a new lease of life for this brownfield redundant site. Planning policy requires efficient use of land to be made, and this proposal would deliver that with 13 new high-quality apartments in a building that rises to a height in line with the neighbouring terraces. It would do so in a manner in a highly sustainable location in very close proximity to Wimbledon, South Wimbledon Station. A mix of 1, 2 and 3 bed homes would be delivered, suitable for first-time buyers, couples and families. And the proposed development falls within the acceptable density range set out within the London Plan and would positively contribute towards Merton's housing targets, which are significant and due to increase in the new London Plan. All the units exceed the London Plan minimum size standards. They benefit from good outlook, and to address the previous appeal decision which your officer made reference to, the rear part of the site remains undeveloped and will be garden land. All apartments will have access to outdoor amenity space. The design has been amended through the process, as I mentioned earlier, to address your design and conservation officer's comments and we welcome officers' support to the proposed design. All of the 1 and 2 bed units are to be made car parking free, so that the future owners of these units will not add to the car parking stress. Only the 2 3-bed family-sized units would have the ability to get parking permits, and this is being addressed through the provision of 2 additional on-street parking bays to ensure that the development does not add on-street parking pressure. We note the objections in respect of the basement and the level of dig. We would draw your attention to condition 18 and the recommendation, which seeks significant documentation in terms of ground movement analysis before commencement of the development to address that. As set out by your officers, no undue harm would result to any neighbours from overlooking, loss of light or sense of enclosure. And significantly, the scheme has no outstanding objections from any statutory consultees, including on any technical matters such as flooding and structural stability. Overall, the application before you seeks to bring this vacant brownfield site back into active use. The proposal accords with local and national planning policy and represents sustainable development of 13 new homes on a brownfield site.
Thank you. Thank you. Any comments?
Just one in response to the issues about the basement. Members will be aware we've got quite a few basement applications here. The relevant documentation has been submitted associated with the application in regard to the structural build of the basement. In terms of issues to the neighbouring properties, that would be a matter for the Party Wall Act between the neighbours. Clearly, it's in the applicant's interest to ensure that the building is built in accordance with the submitted details to ensure there is no disturbance to the neighbours. It's not something we have. I mean, there's plenty of basements being built in Merton. It's not something we've had any significant issue with. But clearly, there could be a first time. But just to emphasise, that's really not a matter that can be a ground for a reason for refusal for this particular case, given the information that's been submitted and agreed by the engineers who have interrogated that information. In terms of the terraces that were mentioned, yes, there are balcony screens, etc., to ensure there would be no significant overlooking onto neighbouring properties. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have Ward Councillor Nigel Benbow. The committee has been given the text of his speech, and I'll pass it to Mr. Benbow. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The proposed development will have 13 flats squeezed into one plot of land. Having a look at the planning application, I am afraid this seems to be a repeat of the problems of the previous planning application of 9 flats and 1 house, which was rejected. Why are none of the previous concern or objections were taken into consideration for the amendment plan, especially the design and parking problems? Why not keep the appearance and the character of the beautiful Victorian houses in Hamilton Road and surrounding areas? Why are none of the proposed flats provide affordable housing, therefore not complying with the council planning policy? Why are the 40,000 contribution? The development is still too large for Hamilton Road, whether or not the proposal would provide acceptable living condition for the occupiers of the new building. It would affect the neighbours at 97 Hamilton Road, 208 to 210 Merchant High Street and 111 Hardy Road with regards to privacy, light and outlook. The claim of the planning statement, section 3.6, state the proposed building will extend to 2.5 story in height, which is misleading. This planning application has a basement, a ground floor, a first floor, a second floor, and a roof terrace. A massive difference. The roof terrace or a roof garden will no doubt overlook the neighbour's garden, balconies or windows, hence invading privacy. Especially if units 5 and 6 use this area as their amenity space. The side and arrangement of the windows at the proposed development are bigger, therefore decreases privacy further. Has this been taken into consideration? The London housing plan say that for protection of privacy, there should be a minimum distance of 18 to 21 meters between facing homes. The developer has failed to state the distance between his development and the opposing houses. The application does not say how the 2 parking spaces will be provided. The current parking on Hamilton Road is extremely difficult, and many already pay parking permits. This really have been mentioned, but clearly that is not enough for 13 flats and fortnightly collections. Again, nothing concrete is mentioned in the application for space. These beings must not be allowed to block the payments on collections days. If this planning application is granted, I fear that there will be a knock-on effect to future planning application, hence destroying the reachable character of our Victorian road, known as the famous battle area. Overall, this latest planning application is over-development. This would not provide a acceptable living condition for future occupiers, as well as the local neighbourhood, ruining the Victorian character of the area and highway safety. Also, the 40,000 contribution is too low. I therefore strongly advise this application should be rejected. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you want to spend a minute reading that before we start the questions? thank you. So I'll open up to questions from the committee, please. Councillor Lanning.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question related to loss of employment on the site. I wonder whether officers could comment on how the application for residential addresses the specific requirements in DME3, specifically how it demonstrates that an employment operation would have a significant adverse effect on the local residential amenity, and also how the size, configuration and access arrangements would make employment on the site unsuitable and financially unviable. Thank you.
Yes, I draw your attention to page 46 in the report, paragraph 7.5 onwards. This draws on the actual existing policy in terms of scattered employment sites. It goes through one by one, reasoning why this particular site could be problematic. Clearly, it's arguable. It's at the end of well, it's a dead-end road because it doesn't go onto Merton High Street. It is within a residential area, fundamentally, therefore could cause problems in the future. And the actual site, in terms of the building and accommodation that was on the site, there was an HMO on the site, house and multiple occupation, with 10 units, and also probably about 200 square metres of employment floor space. It's all gone now, obviously, and been demolished. The report, first of all, goes through those aspects in terms of our policy, but then it concludes at the end that that is not sufficient grounds to refuse the application. But it also goes on to talk about the appeal decision, where the inspector didn't raise that as a particular reason for refusal. So those things combined, we feel there's no grounds to refuse the application on that basis.
If I could just come back on that, I think in the inspector's, in the sort of appeal decision, she says that given her other findings on the other main issues, she's decided not to pursue the matter any further, which would suggest that the other concerns were far more significant, but it doesn't say that she didn't feel that it was important, I would suggest.
Just respond to that. Yes, if the inspector did feel it was important, I mean, the other grounds were quite clear. I'm sure if she did feel it was that important, she would have said so at that particular time. So we have to bear that in mind. I mean, you can read into that what you will, I suppose, but that's how we would interpret it.
Thank you. Councillor Dehaney.
I have two small questions for you. The first one is, I can't see anything here about affordable homes. Are we suggesting that all these 6 flats are affordable? That's my first question. The other one has to do with waste disposal. Are there any adequate provisions? Is this right? They say 6 wheelie bins for 6 flats. Is that right?
Shall I take that through one at a time? Or should we start on the wheelie bins issue first? There was an issue when the application was first submitted. It was considered that the waste facilities were inadequate. The application was then amended. What we now have, and it would be by management. If I go back to this particular, you probably won't see it very easily, but if I can reassure you, at the front and the basement here, you have a significant area there for waste. Now, in terms of the management of the site, clearly there is a lift there as well, so it would be up to the management of the site themselves to ensure that those receptacles are put out on the street in some fashion on the day of collection, like everyone else's bins in flats, etc. Obviously, the individuals in the flats would want that to happen. Everyone wants to put the rubbish out, so it will occur. Obviously, the idea is it would be managed within a particular way when the bin collection was occurring. In terms of the affordable housing, sorry, turn that off. The site has been assessed in the usual fashion through the usual interrogation of the viability through independent assessment. There's no proposal for affordable housing on this particular site, but there is a contribution that is proposed of £40,000. Now that is what was recommended by the independent assessment, and that's all the site can actually deliver. So that's all we can say on that. Clearly we do look to try and put the policy compliant affordable housing on the sites, but it's not always possible.
Councillor Dean.
How many properties were proposed in the dismissed application, and what were the reasons why the inspector dismissed the application?
Yes, there were 9 units were proposed as part of that proposal, and I said in my introduction, well, I've got the plans in the file, it was a different style application. It was entirely different actually. You had the front of the site was for residential units effectively, and they had another building on the back of the site. So I think it's worth saying this is completely different. There are obviously some impacts in terms of what the inspector said about overlinking into properties, etc. A lot of that's eliminated because the back building doesn't exist anymore, it's gone. But clearly what we have done is look very carefully in the report. As you will see, we'll go through one issue at a time in terms of what the potential impacts might be, and this scheme has been adjusted on the way through when it's been negotiated. Certain aspects have been changed, altered, etc. during the process of the application to ensure that neighbouring properties are not significantly overlooked. For instance, the balconies have screening, etc. Condition, is it 32, I think it is? Condition 32 secures screening for balconies. We have obscure glazing in some of the flats as well. So the officer has been through those particular issues. And the report also actually goes through the appeal decision and the issues raised by the inspector at that particular time and addresses those one by one and how those have been overcome by this particular scheme.
Councillor McGrath.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions, please. Can I just, this business about that Councillor Benbow raised in his speech about the minimum distance between the development and nearby houses, which it says should be between 18 and 21 metres in the London plan, but it isn't stated. So I wonder if we can be told what the distance is. And my second question is, on page 41, 5.4, we've got 6 recommendations from the Metropolitan Police. What I'm not clear about is how many of those are actually incorporated in the proposed proposal. Thank you.
Yes, the general rule of thumb in terms of 20 metres is the rule of thumb in terms of window-to-window overlooking. And what we have in the rear of the site, and that's why I pulled this picture up, in the rear of the site, the building comes to about here, which you've got rear windows overlooking the neighbouring properties at the back. Similar to a certain extent, the Rose Cottage obviously did, but at a slightly lower level, and there was other buildings in between. So the distance between the back properties here and the new windows here is about 30 metres, and the report states that. So that's beyond that. But I would the other point I would say is obviously we have windows in residential properties on Merton High Street here as well. Now if we go to the south elevation, which is this one here, you'll see that there's, generally speaking, there aren't any direct overlooking windows. We have these windows here, but obviously they're pointing inwards towards each other. So whilst there will be some obscure overlooking, oblique overlooking to the neighbouring properties, that wouldn't necessarily match that 21 metres direct, because this is reasonably hard on the boundary and the neighbouring windows are sort of between 5 and 10 metres away, so it wouldn't meet that 21, but of course they're not directly overlooking into those windows. Yes, the police. Yes, I believe we have a number of conditions. It's something I was asking about today as well, because there's a lot of recommendations to the police, more than I've seen before actually, in terms of, especially to do with the access to the basement, etc., and access through into the property. There's only so much we can do in planning. There are conditions to try and ensure that that's incorporated. The applicant has agreed to quite a bit of that. In terms of every aspect and every detail of that, let me just get it back up again. I can't guarantee it's all been absolutely secure, but what I also can't guarantee is actually it's absolutely necessary. I think that's the point. Once you go in the front door of a property, generally speaking, then it's under the control of the occupants once you're through the front door. So in terms of the cycle parking, the waste, etc., then generally speaking, that's internal and can be controlled by the occupants of the development, like any flatted development. So I would probably suggest that what's been said by the police isn't necessary, all of it, but I'm pretty sure we have a condition on, if I can just find it, that requests certainly some of it. I'd have to well, if there isn't one, I'm sure there is, we can certainly add one to ensure we can insist on certain amounts of what the police have actually recommended on this particular site. Two seconds, just go through all. Okay, what I suggest is that we can add a condition on, because I can't see it specifically there. I know it was discussed. We can add a condition on that details in accordance with the recommendations from the police are submitted for approval to ensure that we do incorporate some of that. Obviously, as I say, there's only so far we can go with that, but we'll see how much we can do.
Fine. I mean, Chair, just if I can come back on one point, I don't know whether other members would agree with me, but I think it might be quite useful when we do get these documents with recommendations from the police to know which ones of the recommendations have been included in what's being proposed, because then we can it would help to take a view, to my mind.
I'd agree. That's why I was asking the question today. That the case officer was on holiday, so that was the problem I had.
Councillor Southgate, and I'll come to you, Councillor Dino.
Thank you, Chair. The Council's Conservation Officer is quite critical, para 5.5.1, basically about scale and also alignment along the street frontage. And my question really is whether the amendments set out on top of page 46, para 7.2.1, were made before or after her criticism?
Yes, no, it's a good question. I asked the same. Yeah, this response from the Council's Conservation Area Officer related to the original plans that were submitted. So there's been quite a lot of adjustments since then, certainly in terms of the height of the building, the design of the front of the building, so it has been adjusted since then, and that's why the recommendation is to approve.
Councillor D.
So the screening on, I assume at the fifth floor, the screening for the amenity area, I get the impression that's 1.8 metres high. Is that the case?
We normally request 1.7 is the usual height we request for screening.
Okay. What I mean is bloody high, yeah. 1.7, 1.8. So are we talking about basement, ground, first, second, and then 1.7, which is, what's the legal minimum height of a ceiling? About 7 feet, isn't it? That's less than 2 metres, yeah. So basically this is a fifth floor, isn't it? It's as high as 5 floors. But when I look at that image there, that illustration where we've got 4 floors from the front, including the screening, it doesn't seem to be much bigger than next door's 2-storey building. Is that illustration correct? Are there really 5 floors in this? And just so happens that building on the left, which has only got 2 stories, has very tall ceilings?
Well, first of all, we're talking about a basement, which you wouldn't see because that's not part of it. So you can effectively knock that out of the equation from the front of the property. So if we go to the front of the property here, so you have the basement down here. The first floor will be the same as the neighbours. Second floor, same as the neighbours. Third floor, which is the roof scape, that would be the same. And you can see that neighbours already have accommodation within their roofs as well, but it's quite normal. So what you would then see set back on the roof, which is not unusual, away from the street. So if you're on the street, it's debatable whether you'd actually see it because it's sloping well away from you. You'd then have a 1.7 metre high screen around the roof terrace. Again, not unusual, you'll see that on top of buildings quite often. Obviously to ensure no one falls off the roof, but also to ensure that people can't look into the neighbours' properties. So I would argue it's certainly not 5 stories. I would say there is 4 stories of accommodation, which is including in the roof, in the basement, and then you have the amenity area on the top of the roof. But clearly, you would the screening for that top roof element would be visible, certainly from longer views, so you would see it.
The point is, I'm not thinking about the overlooking. I'm thinking about what people can see from the public domain. Now, except the basement can't be seen from the front. But what we can see is something that is 4 stories high next to a building that's 2 stories high. That's the confirmation you've given me.
No, I wouldn't put it like that myself. It's quite clear the plan is the plan. This is an accurate plan. It's verified. So in terms of you have what you would see visually is a 3-storey building similar to next door. The difference being you would have then set back well on the roof, you'd have a balcony screen. So if we go back to the screen here, from the front of the site, the screen is actually around here. So it's set within the top of the roof. So I don't think anyone could describe that as an extra story as such, but I do agree you would see it. Yeah.
You will see it. Yeah, so it's an extra story.
Councillor Southgate and Councillor D.
Thank you. I'm interested in the basement from the rear, and that's going to slope down it's not the basement per se, but the landscaping of the area sloping down to it. I assume the angle of the slope is quite steep, and from that CGI image it would suggest that it's to be hard landscaped.
Well, it's a mix as far as I understand. If I can just take a little bit of time to explain that. At the rear of the property, this is the basement area, so you have these flats here with opening doors, etc., out onto their light wells. So that looks like the hard landscaping in terms of these light well areas here and rear gardens. And as you can see here, you then have a staircase here going up. And it's actually this bit of land here that's up on the ground floor. So they have access not only to these quite generous areas down here, but they can also access this particular element here. And if I move up to the ground floor, you can see that there. So these are the light wells in the ground floor areas, and then you have the staircases up to utilise this area as well. So these steps will obviously go down from ground floor to basement. So they have access to these two flats have access to all this area.
The upper areas would be soft landscape?
It looks on the plan to me, I'd have to, I mean, obviously we put conditions on about landscaping as part of the development. We've certainly done that in the front of the site, because one of the issues the inspector previously brought to everyone's attention was the lack of landscaping in the front of the site. So we have built that into the front of the site there. I would suggest that looks like, you know, we've got trees, etc. there, and it looks like landscaping as opposed to hard landscaping, and I would suggest that looks to be the same. But of course we have a condition, so we can specify that if necessary.
Councillor Dehaney.
I have a great deal of understanding for these 4 units without their own private amenity space. And when you look at the other units 1, 2, 3, and 4, you see the huge amount they have. Why is it not possible for the developer to have a different share out of amenity space? Is there anything on the diagram you could show us of those 4 units without space?
It's a logistical problem in terms of a constrained site. And what the answer to the question is, they've got 123 square metres of floor space on the roof that they would share. In reality, I would suggest that people living in their individual flats with their individual amenity space are likely to use their individual amenity space. I would suggest that the 4 flats that don't have a significant, well, don't have any in terms of associated with their flat, are probably likely to gravitate towards the roof. So those 4 flats, I suspect, would use the roof area, whereas those with their individual spaces would use their own areas. But of course, they can all use the roof area if necessary. It's quite a large space.
Any more questions? Councillor Dean.
In terms of our planning policies over the years, I think the aim has always been for dual aspect flats. So maybe I misheard this, but are all the flats dual aspect?
Now, it's very difficult to, on a constrained site, it's really difficult to ensure that every flat is dual aspect. Even on very large development sites, you'll see us putting forward, 30, 40% non-dual aspect flats, because it's very difficult to do on a particular site. Unless, of course, you were to make the flats absolutely enormous. You have duplex flats here in the ground floor. So there are some of the flats go from basement into the ground floor, so it's two levels of accommodation. So we think that's quite a benefit in terms of someone just being stuck on the basement floor with a 2-bedroom flat. They have actually accommodation on the ground floor, so they'll have a better quality of light into those areas on the ground floor.
Any further questions, or can we move on to comments? Councillor Macon. Is it a question or a comment?
Could you comment? The residents or the objectors, when they vote in, made a big issue about basement flooding in some ways. I know you've covered it a bit in the bit I didn't quite like where you put. Could you highlight that again? As to why what the residents said is not correct.
Well, it's an issue that wasn't covered in the previous appeal properly. And the inspector did raise that as a particular problem for the site. It wasn't resolved that particular time because the detail wasn't submitted. Obviously, the applicant hasn't ignored that. They've gone back with relevant studies, etc., to ensure that the flooding issue is not going to be a problem. It's an engineering solution, as it always is. It's a complicated one. I'm not going to pretend I know how it's done, but it is done on the particular site, and the reports are in, and our officers who look at that, the engineers and the flooding officer, are satisfied that it will actually work.
Thank you.
Another question. And also, going back to the report again, on the residents, on the consultation bit, the letters Ray, there's an enormous amount of paper being used for these objections. There aren't that many normally. It's, there's some that say things like, they have not seen this document. Have we seen this document? London plan density levels, parking spaces, 33 volt panels on the roof, but the plan only shows 20. What?
Well, I'd say, I mean, in terms of the sustainability officer has looked at the site overall, and there's a section in the report that explains that. Obviously, what we do is we say what residents are saying. I'm not saying it's necessarily accurate every time, and quite often I request officers, if there's a comment that's inaccurate, put in brackets, so offers a comment and then correct it. For instance, I haven't counted the solar panels, whether it's 20 or 33, but the officer who's investigated that is quite satisfied what's being proposed. So I'm afraid I couldn't tell you whether it was right or wrong. Obviously, what will fit on the roof will fit on the roof, but it's satisfactory in terms of policy.
Thank you. Can we move on to comments, please? Councillor Dean.
Well, I think if the illustration was the reality, then it looks very nice. Sadly, I think the illustrator's in the living room of the people who live opposite, because there seems to be a very broad road that I don't recall when I've been down there. There's no double yellow lines like I see, and I still really struggle with a building that is clearly has 3 stories at the front and then screening of 1.7, which can be seen from the road, yet I can't really see it on the illustration. So the reality is that we've got at least 3 stories of accommodation plus 1.7 metres, which is more than the legal height of a ceiling. So I can't see why this isn't seen as 4 floors from the front side. And of course from the back, where people live in Hardy Road, they are looking at 5 stories, and that's the reality here. I think it's very easy for us to say yes to things because there's a housing need, but I think it's also important that we look at our development policies. And the policies over the year have always said that we shouldn't look at single aspect flats, because it's people buying these places and then having to live in them is much more difficult when you just have one side of windows. It means that there is a compromise internally. That could be with the bathroom, that could be with other rooms too. And I don't think that we should be advocating anything that has a majority of apartments being single aspect flats. There's also the issues in terms of employment land. And I think finally, the struggle I really have is that the history is not a positive one. Council officers, inspectors, residents, no one has been positive about anything that's been put on this site, not once. It's been rejected. It's been rejected locally. It's been rejected nationally. Applications have been withdrawn. Yet this particular application is the biggest of the lot. And if logic dictates that smaller applications, less apartments, have been rejected roundly by not just council officers, not just the inspector, but also residents, I can't see how we can accept this application tonight.
Thank you. Any further comments? Councillor Dehaney.
You're looking at
Is this a question or a comment?
21.
Oh, sorry, I think I'm looking at the wrong one.
Are you looking at the correct report?
It starts at 33 of the application.
Leave it for the other one, that's fine, sorry about this.
Any further comments? Councillor Southgate.
Councillor Dean has been far more articulate. There's just subjectively a sense of trying to cram a bit too much in. The basements, the roof terrace. Looking at that, the sense that it's sort of goldfish bowl living a bit for the people in there, isn't it? I mean, it would be great if you were looking into the distance on your Capability Brown Design Lake, but you're looking 20 metres across the road at the other people's bedroom. And I'm sorry, it's not any more thought through than that, other than an attempt to cram a bit too much onto the site. So I'm not going to query the density levels. They are within permitted bounds, but still within the context of the local streetscape, it's rather more than I think the site will bear.
Any further comments? Councillor Dean.
So one thing I didn't mention is a very beautiful road. This has got enormous history. What was there before may not have been the most beautiful of buildings, but it's one of the most historic buildings, and it's gone. And the rest of this road, as Councillor Bembo said, is I see things all the time saying, well, we've got this in, we can knock down a couple of terraced houses and do exactly the same. And as much as we say we have to look at what's in front of us, the reality is we have to look at what is ahead of us. And it is a beautiful road. I think that the applicant has done a very good job here. And I thought his speech was very positive, and he picked up a lot of the points that really matter. But he is still trying to do too much. And I think we have to reject this on bulk and massing. I would like to see some car parking spaces too, because I think there's a red herring coming out of this. But I think we should roundly reject this on bulk and massing, and then let's see it come back. And then the people living in that road will enjoy it more, but most importantly, the people living in it will enjoy it more too.
Councillor Chung.
Thank you, Chair. All the points that have been made so far are very important points, but I think it's actually one ought to be mindful that we live in an environment where there's a scarcity of housing. People are desperately looking to have somewhere to live. The issue has to be whether we're seriously compromising people living in spaces which are actually not going to be in the interest of their well-being. We're not the experts. Right? I'm not an expert. And the officers themselves have actually said there's nothing untowards that they would want to object to this. So I think while maybe we can go back and review the various points that are made, I think it's very important that we proceed to look at how they can be addressed so that we can make something of this particular site in the way that is being proposed.
Firstly, it's the Council's planning policies, the guidelines to say that apartments should be dual aspect. So we are not trying to go against, this is Council Officer policy, and this goes into the Mayor of London, and this goes into the NPPF as well, national policy, as far as I understand. I think the second point, really, I perk up a bit when I see something where there isn't any affordable homes. And as much as you say people are desperate for housing, I can tell you this, people on average wage will not be purchasing these properties. So we've got to be very clear here. If there was affordable homes here, I would feel emotionally more positive about this. But we do not have that. And I think we have to reject this on the basis of it's bulk and massing. Let's see it come back because we think this can make a positive contribution. We might even see the odd affordable home. But let's think about the people that live there and live in it.
Okay, so you're making a proposal to reject on bulk and massing. Do you have a seconder? Councillor Southgate. Okay. So can we do a vote on bulk and massing? All in favour? Could you keep your hands up, please? Could you? Those against? So the application has been refused. On to item 9, land adjacent to 163A Mostyn Road.
Thank you, Chair. The application is for the erection of a one-bed, single-storey detached dwelling house and for the resurfacing of existing access routes and associated security gates. Again, if I take you through the plan, you'll see it's a rather unusual location, this one. This is Mostyn Road here, and as you see behind it, we have this. I'll show some photographs later, but I'm not quite sure what you can see from those either. This is probably the best way to understand where this particular site is. We have number 163 here, which is a cottage, and that actually has a residential access in between the terrace properties at the front. And then we have this little parcel of land at the back, where this particular development is being proposed. You'll see there's also a history to this site. There has been a refused application. The applicant has come back with a reduced size. It's only single story, so obviously officers feel it doesn't have significant impact. But take you through the back. This is the back alleyway. That's a photograph. If you stood here looking downwards, that's what you'd see. So you'll see it's very overgrown. In fact, it's, I went down the other day, and I think it's probably a little bit worse than that now. Again, you'll see here, this is the access way that they're seeking to improve into the site. And this is the site itself. This is one of the neighbouring garages. So you'll see the access way here. You have the residential houses, Mostyn Road here, and then you have this rather unusual plot of land at the back of the site. If I go back again, just so you got your bearings. So that's the site you were looking at. It was stood in the alleyway there. There's residential properties to the right-hand side, and you were looking at the site on the front. It's quite overgrown, as you can see. Again, this is looking at the cottage next door. So you can see there's quite a bit of space between the site and the cottage. But again, it's quite overgrown and quite difficult to get access to actually see properly. Again, this is taken in winter, so you can see the cottage behind, and this is the site that would be alongside the cottage's site there. This is the access way into the site. This would be upgraded, as I'll show you in the plans in a minute. And again, the access way through would be upgraded along its full length, as you'll see on the plan. And that's the access, I believe that's access through to number 163, the cottage. So that wouldn't be part of this particular proposal. So here we are in terms of the plot itself, if you remember where it is in relation to the cottage. And what they're proposing to do, due to previous refusals, was it was considered that the access route through wasn't acceptable. Well, you can see why we said that previously, because the photographs. What they're actually proposing to do now is to put permeable paving down to ensure that it's a lot more attractive in terms of access to this particular property. I mean, there's no car parking in the front of the property, it's pedestrian access in reality. So this is the location. As I said, it is unusual, but it is single story, and officers consider it doesn't significantly impact on the neighbours because of that single story nature. So again, you'll get a view here of it's just a one-bedroom flat, one-bedroom property, so it's quite small. There is a terrace area, there is some outdoor space. It complies with all the relevant policies, etc., in terms of space. And it's a little bit difficult to determine what it's going to look like. It's actually built of brick. It was going to be, it's built of wood. It was going to be brick built in terms of the externals, but now there is going to be a fence that's more in keeping with the local area in terms of how these particular properties are divided. So you can see it peeking over the top of the particular fence that's going to put up. It's under 3 metres in height, actually, less than you could do under permitted development normally in an extension on a rear house. So whilst it's an unusual site, officers feel that there's no real grounds to refuse the application due to the height of what's being proposed. It's no bigger than a garage really, and the area is characterised, well, there's a garage next door that's not significantly different in terms of scale and size. It complies with all the internal policy, the policies for internal space, for the amenity space, and therefore it's considered that there won't be any significant grounds to refuse the application. So that's the artist's impression of how the back alleyway may look. This is the fenced area here, and behind that you can just see the roof of the property itself. So all the other residential properties are obviously set well away. There's also a boundary between this proposed property and the cottage to the side as well, so there won't be any amenity impacts to the neighbours. So for all those reasons, the application is considered to be acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two objectors, so could I please ask Mr. Stephen Bradley, are you... Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for your time, everyone. My property is directly opposite the proposed applicant. It's where we are is like a cul-de-sac. It's by South Merton Railway Station. Several reasons for objecting, least of all for the inconvenience that we obviously cause and the disruption to all the neighbours as such, myself in particular. I am a little surprised that it's seemingly being proposed or recommended subject to section 106, I understand, having previously been declined, I think 2 or 3 times previously. The access, you've mentioned 2 or 3 access, one of which is certainly opposed by my next door neighbour, which is 155 Moston, where there's an alley there. And also there's a tree, which you've not mentioned, that is actually in the land and borders the boundary of both the owned by my next door neighbour 155 and the proposed applicant. The tree, I believe, is between 6 and 8 metres high. I'm not quite sure how that's going to affect any proposed building, and certainly 155 Moston Road will not approve the removal of that tree. As I say, the road itself is particularly busy. Permits are required. Undoubtedly, parking will be an additional burden for those. But the main reason for objection would be emergency access. As I say, this property is proposed to be adjacent to what is by South Merton Railway Station. I'm not quite sure how, in the event of an emergency, how a fire engine or anything like that would be able to access down that very small alleyway. And I'll just very briefly go back to the previous refusal, which said the proposed development, by reason for its siting, mass and design, would, in conjunction with the existing adjacent dwelling, appear increasingly incongruous by consolidating an unsatisfactory form of backland development contrary to certain boom, 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 boom. So I'm sorry for waffling on there a little bit, but deeply opposed to this, as I know the majority, if not all of the majority of the residents are in that particular area. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Carol Harvey.
Hello, my name's Carol Harvey, and I'd like to thank you all on behalf of my neighbours for the changes that you've already asked to be made to this property that's supposed to be recommended. We are a bit concerned. We'd like to clarify really the access to this site, as 155 has already said that they won't allow access. So which way is it going to go? We've also heard about installation of CCTV. Who's going to own that? Who's going to monitor it? Who's going to be responsible for it? And how high is it going to be? Because my back garden backs on to near this property, and at the moment it looks like I'm going to have to raise my fence if there's going to be a CCTV out the back there. With the installation of the locked gates, we'd like to know where they're going to be positioned. Have the people or the property owners been asked or approached as to whether they can put gates up to their properties, and who's going to fit them, and also who's going to be responsible for those gates. Are they going to be locked? Who's going to have the key? And where will the key be kept in case of emergencies? If I need somebody to come to the back of my property to mend anything, then how are they going to get to the back of my property if the access is locked for tradespeople, deliveries? Regarding the building and the laying of the road, we'd also like to know who that road is going to be owned by. Is it the council or is it the residents? Because regarding its upkeep, we as the residents haven't been asked about that. We have the residents from 151 to 130, if it's going to go all the way down to Aylwood Road, they haven't been consulted about the laying of a road either. Also, I think the lighting as well that they're going to put in, is that going to be low lighting or high lighting? Because the high lighting could be an intrusion to the houses that back onto this property, i.e. my garden and my neighbour's garden. And it also, I believe, would have a negative impact on wildlife. I might be a bit crazy, but I have a little colony of hedgehogs down my road, and they go between 155 and 175, and that colony of hedgehogs could actually be disturbed by the building and erection of a property there. And they hibernate between October and April. And is this fence going to have a hole for them to go in and out of? Because at the moment we have about 5 or 6 hedgehogs down there, and I know they're not protected species, but they're actually in decline, so we're quite proud that we've actually got our colony there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The applicant in, Mr. Ian Hurley.
Thank you, Chair.
You have 6 minutes.
The application before you this evening is the result of 5 years of hard work from all parties involved, dating back to the first application in 2014. This time has allowed us to work closely with the council officers, and the results are undoubtedly been to the benefit of the proposed scheme presented to you this evening. During that time, we have listened to the council's professional team and taken on board all of their suggested amendments. This application is therefore being recommended for approval by the council's planning officers, the climate change officers, transport and highways officers, and the council's tree officers, as well as the Metropolitan Police's designing out crime officers. The planning merits of the scheme are comprehensively covered in the officer's report, so I won't go over that. I will, however, highlight a couple of key points. The site is within an established residential area and adjacent to an existing residential property. The existing access routes to and from the site are already established, and no new access routes are being proposed as a result of this application. The site is within a sustainable location with a good PTEL rating of 4. The site is not a random allotment in the middle of nowhere, and it has no useful existing use. The proposals set out in this application are designed to the highest quality, and the application is proposing to erect a modest one-bedroom bungalow, which will be set back from its boundaries and screened on all sides by a timber fence. Views to and from the proposed new building will therefore be extremely limited and mainly consist of the new green roof. To put the scale of the bungalow into context, members may recall the outbuilding that was approved at last month's meeting at 110 Gladstone Road. This building would actually be lower than that. This also needs to be kept in mind when concerns are raised with respect to disruption. This would be a very quick, very simple, environmentally friendly project using modern building techniques causing minimum disruption. The application also proposes to regenerate the surrounding area by resurfacing the existing access routes with high-quality, low-maintenance permeable surfacing. It also proposes the installation of security gates, low-level lighting, and CCTV. All of these will be agreed via condition, and the detailed design of which can be discussed with the council in further detail. All of the residents will have access to the gates. With respect to the character of the area, members can see from the photographs that the existing site is derelict. The site is currently used for fly tipping. Likewise, this area surrounding the site is unkept, overgrown, and in a poor state of disrepair, with the residents dumping rubbish they don't want in their own gardens. Both the site and surrounding area adversely affect the character and appearance of the area, and as a result, it's poorly used and never maintained. The area is currently open for anyone to walk along at any time of day or night and provides a dark and dingy environment. The restricted lines of sight also create many areas of concealment. These provide hiding places and encourage criminal behaviour, which adds to the undesirability of the area. The application represents an opportunity to regenerate this area and restore the access routes to their original intended purpose. The new surfacing will provide clear routes, making it much more convenient for residents to use, increasing natural surveillance, and therefore improving security as a result. The proposed gates will also increase security and legibility. This will significantly improve the quality of the communal environment, hopefully encouraging local residents to take ownership of the area. With respect to a couple of comments that residents made, ownership is an issue that we have dealt with in detail with the council. We have taken legal advice, the council has taken legal advice, and there is a sufficient condition attached to any permission. With respect to emergency vehicles, it's important to note that there is already a residential property down the alleyway, and this application will significantly improve access to the site. You'll note that this is also dealt with in the committee report. To conclude, the bungalow will fit comfortably within its own site, sit lower than any of the surrounding buildings, easily fulfill the density standards, comfortably exceed minimum space standards, is fully compliant with amenity space requirements. Furthermore, it is set back from the front of the site and screened on all sides. There will be no direct views into any of the surrounding properties. The application would also significantly improve the character and visual appearance of the site and surrounding area, environmental health and safety of the area, and access and security of the area. It will also provide much needed residential accommodation. We therefore respectfully request that members approve this application in line with their officers' recommendations and planning policy guidance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, a few issues raised there, certainly by residents. Disruption for the build, that's the same as any build, obviously. Clearly, it's a small build, so I would suggest it wouldn't be too disruptive in terms of to the neighbours. It probably wouldn't be a very long build either, but that's the same as any development that is approved. The matter of the legal agreement was mentioned. That's just for a permit-free development. There is no parking on site, and the other aspects of the Section 106 relate to the payments, etc., to ensure that the developer pays for that. Access arrangements. I understand there has been some legal advice on this. My understanding is that is to say that it's not really something to be considered as part of the planning application. If the applicant has rights of access or not, that will be resolved between the owners of the properties. If the owner doesn't have rights of access, then I assume they won't be able to build the site out. So that's the conclusion on that. Tree was mentioned. I've got that photograph. I've just been checking the report. You can just see it. I believe it's this tree here. It's not a very healthy specimen. I've noticed the tree officer hasn't brought it up as a particular issue. There's no TPO on the site. There is another tree that they're looking at to ensure it's not damaged in any way further on the site. That's tree there, I believe. So if I look on this photograph here, you have this tree that appears to be on the site. You can tell it's actually got damage there in any event. So it doesn't look like it's worthy of retention in any event. But that's not been raised as an issue by the tree officer. Emergency access was mentioned. That's an issue really for building control. If there are any issues around that, then it's up to the developer to demonstrate that that can actually be done. There are different methods of doing that, as we've heard before at this committee, in terms of having either fire hydrants, sprinklers within the building, or if it's in a particular distance to a fire engine, if it can access a certain point, then it can pull the relevant equipment through. We then had about the gates. Again, it's a matter between the developer and the residents in terms of the lock gates. If residents have rights over that land, that's a matter for them to raise with the developer. So we I don't believe we know exactly who the road or the back area is owned by under normal circumstances. It tends to be owned by the residential properties in some fashion. That's the usual arrangement. Lighting, that would be, again, covered by condition. So in terms of that, hasn't been determined yet. Hedgehogs was mentioned. Certainly, if we can accommodate that in any particular way, if the application is approved, we could add a condition on to ensure there is some protection of the hedgehogs. It's a species I know that's about 50% in decline at the moment, so it's been hit quite hard recently. And again, legal ownership was mentioned, and I think that's a matter to be resolved between the residential occupiers or the owners of these passageways and the applicant. Nothing we can necessarily get involved in as an authority. Thank you.
Thank you. On to any questions from the members. Councillor McGrath, please.
Thanks. On the hedgehogs, do we need to put that formally into the... Do we need to make a formal proposal here that there be the arrangements so the hedgehogs can continue their wanderings about, or is that just going to be done by you?
No, if members wish to do that, we can certainly specify that. There is normally a condition regarding ecology in any event, but we can certainly add a bit about hedgehog protection and other aspects that may be raised in terms of ecology.
Do I need to propose that formally, Chair?
I think you just have done, really,
okay,
if members have.
Do you have a seconder? Yeah. Take your pick.
Thank you. Great. Okay, great.
Councillor Southgate.
Arrangements for refuse, they're discussed here, but not really satisfactorily resolved at para 7.35. The applicant may need to explore alternative refuse collection arrangements. Don't we as a local authority have a statutory obligation to collect waste from households?
They do generally, but obviously it's a slightly unusual site, this one, in terms of the travel distances. So it may be the case that I'm not sure it's absolutely definite, 20 metres I've heard is the max that the delivery service will pick up bins. So it may well be the case that, similar to any building with a long drive, they would have to put the rubbish out themselves in the wheelie bins and wheel them down to be picked up.
Any further questions? Councillor Southgate.
Para 7.18, in conjunction with the separation of 14 metres from the closest property, which property is that, and why are we settling for less than 20?
The 14 metres that were mentioned there is the rear of the properties, the two-storey properties here on the main road, and the application property front of the property is here. But of course, they can't see anything out the front of the property, so there isn't any overlooking issues because you're talking about single-storey property. If we go to the front elevation, it's difficult to see sometimes, but you have a front fence. So in other words, there is the front fence, so there won't be any issues. They'll be looking into the rear fence of the neighbouring properties. So that distance isn't really relevant in this particular case.
Any further questions? Okay. Councillor Chung.
I wonder if you could answer this for me. Given the state of the environment as it stands at the moment, and I've seen some of the pictures, given the development that will go in, would you say that that would be an enhancement of the environmental area if that property was to go in there?
Depends what you define as an enhancement of the area. In terms of the rubbish, etc., and the ground, you would have this cleared up and it would be paved. Some may argue that it's better left as a wild area, depending on what's an enhancement and what isn't. But certainly in terms of the access way through, you would have porous paving all the way through here. If I go back to the plan, you can see on this plan, actually it might be on that plan as well, probably better here, showing here, you'll see the resurfaced areas here. So they would be resurfaced. So in terms of visually, it depends whether you prefer to see a resurfaced area or whether you feel that's preferable. Clearly, the rubbish is that's something would certainly improve it if the rubbish was removed, but it's not unusual to have areas like this at the back of houses. So it depends on your view.
Thank you. On to comment. Questions? Okay, Councillor Macon, please.
You mentioned, is this a car-free development? Because there doesn't seem to be, and in which case whoever possesses it has to park somewhere in the area.
Well, it's car-free, so they wouldn't be able to get a permit. It's very close to the station, obviously, so it's a highly accessible location. So that's what's been proposed before us, and we don't feel there's grounds to refuse on Highways issues.
Councillor Dehaney?
Just a comment.
I thought it was a question you would like.
Oh, it's still at the question stage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, comments. Councillor Dehaney.
Most, if not all, the alleyways I know are overgrown and fly-tipped and really not used. So I think this idea of, you know, paving it over, whatever it is a very good idea, and it enhances the area. And I hope when the gates go in, each resident is given a key, because the alleyway belongs to all of them, and they should have access at any time. So they should be given a key. And it's a shame that we couldn't resolve that issue, which has to go to building control or whatever he says, because that's a very important point. They should have access to the alleyway, regardless of what else is going on.
Thank you. Councillor Southgate?
I'd like to update you, Chair, and members on the state of the alleyway. I went back to remind myself on Tuesday, and it is way more overgrown than that. In fact, it is impenetrable now, and it has its own loveliness. There are access issues. Let me just correct the point about this being permit-free. You can make it permit-free if you like, but cars can be parked in Aylward Road at the north end of the access track, which is the one holdout road in Merton Park against the CPZ. So that would add to the existing congestion in Aylward Road, which is now the nearest parking point for South Merton Station. I think overall, this is entirely about access and really the narrowness of those tracks. Okay, you know, emergency access, we can talk about fire hydrants. We know we couldn't get an ambulance down there. Refuse will have to be by some special arrangement, which will leave the neighbours unhappy if they have the wheelie bins left outside their properties on collection days. The dwelling itself ticks the right boxes in terms of size and amenity space. It is completely an issue about whether it is actually feasible and realistic to build on this very small plot, given how, if you like, isolated it is on the via the access routes. And I've seen representations from neighbours. There's a lot of dispute about whether permission would be given. I'm not going to enter into that. I would only say that, having been involved in negotiating alley-gate schemes in the past, that every one of the neighbours has to fall in line with that if it's to go ahead. So there's quite a lot of fraught negotiation to take place here before really it would be sensible to consider going ahead with building this. So my concerns are entirely about access and whether this plot is ever actually developable for even the smallest of dwellings.
Any further comments? Councillor Southgate, would you like to make a proposal?
At the previous reasons for refusal, which referenced an unsatisfactory form of backland development, and I think we've still got that situation now. Comment from the John Lennon Society: obtrusive backland development which will adversely affect the amenities of neighbours would not provide acceptable living conditions for the occupiers. I mean, if whoever wants to live here wants to settle for those access arrangements, then fine. But it is the backland nature that leaves this site really stranded to an unacceptable degree from all normal utilities and
Do you have a seconder? In that case, we'll go to the vote. So, those in favour, including the condition regarding the hedgehogs, those in favour? Those against? Not voting? 1, 2, 3. Granted. Just a matter of note, the people at the back, you are allowed to leave if your application's been heard, but if you're more than welcome to stay until about probably 10 o'clock. Item 6, 24 The Grange.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's an application to... Sorry. Yes, the application is to vary condition 2 of an approved plan attached to the Planning Permission 19 PO155 and relating to the erection of a single storey linked to the existing coach house and excavation of a basement and erection of a single storey rear extension. Essentially, the applicant has come back in with they already have a basement approval, and what they're intending to do alongside the existing proposal and the existing permission is to extend the basement. So there's one very simple plan here I think I need to show you. It's quite a simple binary decision about whether you feel this is acceptable or not. If I pull that particular plan up, here it is. So you might not be able to see that, but hopefully you can. So you have the permission that show in green. In other words, it was going to be located effectively underneath and slightly to the side of the property. What they're proposed to do is add another, it's about 120 square metres. In other words, this blue section at the back, that's the additional basement area they're proposing. And if you recall, the policy is more than 50% of the garden. And what they've actually done on this plan as well, which is quite helpful, is show what they could do under the actual policy, in other words, the red. Now, they're not proposing to do that. What they're proposing to do is the blue. So all we're talking about is going from effectively a basement that went to the side and underneath the property, this element here. Everything else remains the exact same. So that's the only decision you're making this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one objector, Mr. Michael O'Connell. You have 3 minutes, Mr. O'Connell.
Good evening. I'm Michael O'Connell. I live at 25 The Grange, next door to number 24. I'm also representing the owner of number 23. This is the third planning application submitted by the owners of number 24. The first application was submitted in September 2017, nearly 2 years ago, and the size of the basement keeps on changing with each submission. Application 1, the basement dimension was 240 square metres. This application was rejected by this committee and the appeal dismissed by the Planning Inspectorate. Application number 2, the basement dimension was reduced to 160 square metres and the application was approved. This application number 3 seeks to amend the size of the basement and increase it to 309 square metres. That's 3,326 square feet. I understood a line had been drawn in the sand when application 2 was given the go-ahead. One condition being that the basement be reduced to 160 square metres, which is the footprint of number 24. To quote Pembroke Planning in its cover letter of today's application, this was done following officer feedback and in response to objections received. It does seem there are miscalculations in the measurements on pages 22 and 26 of the planning officer's report, which the committee is now reading. That claim the proposal will result in just an extra 110 square metres, not the correct figure of an extra 150 square metres. This does not rank as being a minor material amendment, as it increases the basement outside the curtilage of the existing house by 93%, namely approved 160 to 309. It is clearly a major material amendment. It follows that the Planning Committee and the Planning Inspector rejected the basement of 240 for the reasons given in the appeal notice and basically set out in 12 letters of objection. In the appeal decision, the Inspector states, and I quote, "The Council considers the proposal to be harmfully excessive, and a number of local people have used terminology such as overdevelopment. I would concur with this," end quote. So why now has the planning officer changed his mind on this matter? On behalf of my neighbours and myself, I ask the committee to reject this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connell. Mr. Chris Purvis, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And if at some point I could ask someone to correct most of the numbers in there, because I think they were mostly incorrect, that the gentleman just said. My name is Chris Purvis, and my wife Hannah and I are the owners of 24 The Grange. Today I hope to demonstrate to you that whilst permission already exists for a basement of around 200 square metres, shown in the green, the additional 130 square metres is appropriate when viewed against the approved ground floor footprint of 320 square metres. And that's shaded in grey on the chart, as well, and well within the planning threshold for a basement on this plot of around 640 square metres, the red line. Our first application, as we've heard, in 2018 was unfortunately refused at both Planning Committee and Appeal, as members and the inspector considered that gaps between the buildings above ground were important to the character of the conservation area. Critically, the basement element was considered acceptable. The Appeal Inspector stated explicitly in his report that neither he nor the Council had an issue with the basement, which had an area of around 280 square metres, shown in orange, and thus was only slightly smaller than the basement under consideration today at around 330 square metres. Following our successful second planning application, pre-application discussions were had with officers regarding extending the property at roof level to gain extra space that we felt we needed. The officers were not keen and considered it more appropriate to extend the house at basement level, ensuring no impact on the conservation area. As a result of that conversation with officers, we come to you today with an application to extend the consented basement to around 330 square metres, almost exactly the same size as the approved ground floor footprint. As you can see, a 330 square metre basement is well within the parameters set by the Council's planning policy, as current policy would allow for a basement of up to 640 square metres. Put another way, we are asking for a basement today that is roughly half the size of the maximum allowed within Merton planning policy on this plot. Basements which are near to the maximum area of Merton's policy have been before committee and were granted planning permission. A case in point was number 49 in the neighbouring Murray Road, where this committee recently unanimously granted permission for a basement extending almost 50% under the rear garden and to within 1 metre on either side of the boundary. In contrast, we are proposing to extend only 16% into the garden, well within that 50% threshold, and we have deliberately kept the basement well away, some 5 metres from our neighbours' boundaries on both sides. You'll even notice there's actually a house between the basement and the neighbour on the right-hand side there. It goes without saying that the basement will not be visible from the road. We appreciate, as with any building project, there will be a period of disruption, and the draft conditions will ensure this is well controlled, as well as the additional suggested conditions 17 and 18 relating to structural works. In conclusion, we are proposing a basement only slightly larger than one that members and the Appeal Inspector previously had no issues with. That is almost exactly the same size as the ground floor footprint of the house, and critically that is around half the size of what is technically allowed by Merton policy. Thank you.
Just a couple of minor issues. In terms of the report and what was stated in the report in terms of the size of the increase in the basement, I'm quite happy to accept what the applicant said there, and of course the objector is also correct. It is 110 is incorrect, it is actually 130. That's how in the introduction I mentioned around about 120, 30. That was my understanding of it as well. Having said that, to be fair, I think, to be fair on the applicant, in terms of the previous appeal, it was in relation to the development on the site in terms of extensions, not the basement. So therefore, it wasn't raised as a significant issue at that particular time. Thank you.
Thank you. On to questions from the members. Councillor Lanning, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a question about page 24, paragraph 5.5, 5.6, whether there have been any comments received by the flood risk manager or the structural engineer, just because I would have thought that those would be quite important comments to receive.
Yes, sorry, I should have said right at the beginning in terms of the, you see the modification sheet, and you'll see quite a number of conditions that have been attached since the information has now been received in relation to that particular aspect.
Councillor Henry.
I just want to find out what the reason for the extension of the basement, and also will there be any risk to the other residents' structures of their houses?
It's not really for officers to determine what should be in the basement or not. It's up to the applicant in terms of what they wish to put in there in terms of accommodation. We're looking at normally it's buildings that you can see above ground, but clearly this is a basement. In terms of the neighbours, the one thing I would point out, if you look at the blue line that's being proposed, it's slightly unusual because quite often you have these basements cheek by jowl with neighbours, whereas actually this one is separated by quite a bit of distance. Apart from this particular element here, which I presume is a light well, then that goes up closer to the boundary, but generally speaking, the basement's set well within the site.
Any more questions? Comments, please. No comments? Councillor Southgate.
This basement would accommodate six houses of the size we've just approved.
There's a comment. It's a large basement, yes, but it's within policy parameters.
Could we go on to the vote, please? Those in favour? Could we put our hands up, please? Those in favour? Those against? And not voting? It's granted. On to item 8, flat 1237 Kingston Road.
Thank you, Chair. This is for the erection of a single-storey rear extension. I'll introduce it simply, but I think you all know on the committee it's not a simple matter. It's something that's got quite a history to it, and no doubt you will recognise it. It's been to committee a number of times. The report sets out that particular history. It also sets out the appeal decision. The appeal was dismissed. But having said that, throughout the appeal statement, officers have interrogated that statement to have a look at what the reasons for refusal were, and they were quite reasonably simple. The extension that was proposed, the inspector considered that the rear elevation of the extension wasn't in keeping with the house. So what's happened is the applicant has changed the proposal, so the extension itself now has this proposal instead of it being a flat rear end to the extension. It now has a bay window. It matches in terms of materials, it's appropriate materials in terms of the house. What they've also done, and you'll see this clearly in the report, and I would draw your attention to paragraph 731. So what they've done is extended the extension 0.3 metres into the side alleyway. They have increased the height of the extension underneath the sill of the neighbouring property above by 0.3 metres, and they've increased the height of the eaves by 0.2 metres. So in other words, 300 centimetres, 200 centimetres, and 300 centimetres wider in the plot. The report goes on to say what the inspector's view was of this particular element of the extension projecting beyond the side elevation. But of course, what the inspector hasn't done is assess this particular case. In other words, this one is slightly larger, so this has not been before an inspector. But what the applicant and what officers are arguing is it's not significantly bigger than what's been approved it was actually refused previously by the inspector in terms of what was proposed previously, where the inspector didn't raise any issues in terms of the height of the building. I know this committee absolutely did have concerns with that. Let's be clear on that. But officers are taking on board what the inspector has said, and they're of the view that the slight raising and widening of the extension is not significant enough to warrant refusal based on what the previous inspector said, and based on the fact that the real elevation has been improved in terms of its design. So therefore it's recommended for approval. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one objector, Mr. Peter Hammond. Thank you.
Evening. There are no significant changes to the scheme before you that address the issues identified by this committee since the last application was rejected by you. You'll be aware that this is now the fourth planning application submitted by this architect developer for an oversized extension onto the rear of his small one-bedroom garden flat. The Victorian house is divided into 4 such flats. The previous applications have all been rejected by Merton and then by the planning inspectorate. They were all deemed too big, and the width, height, depth and overall bulk specifically cited as reasons for rejection. Indeed, not only have these reasons not been addressed, but the applicant has seen fit to increase the footprint in his latest plans, making it some 15% larger. From the beginning, Merton Planning drew a clear red line as to what they could find acceptable, stating that anything bigger than 3.5 metres from the rear of the Victorian house and anything wider than the original building was deemed materially harmful. The applicant has consistently disregarded this advice. In fact, these latest plans show a further increase in width from those last rejected by you, making the extension even wider than the original house. The depth is also greater. The height still encroaches on the flat above. It impacts the other neighbours on 3 sides who've also objected. Plus, the design includes a flat roof. It is not modest. It projects 5.3 metres into the garden from the rear of the house and is 6.8 metres wide. The house itself is only 5.8 metres wide. The extension would build over the majority of the garden. I refer you to the local conservation area design guide, which states, rear extensions should be sympathetically designed, subordinate to the main house. Flat roofs should be avoided and rear gardens preserved. While some minor aesthetic changes have been made to the appearance of the extension, they do not reduce the effect of unbalancing the house, which would be seen from the road. In addition, the extension compromises security at the rear, makes repairs to the back wall of the roof of the original house prohibitively difficult, and the occupants above will suffer from a sense of enclosure. The impact on all 3 of the flats above in this building should not be underestimated. Their outlook would be irrevocably altered. The material harm that would be done by this extension has not changed. It's evident that nobody lives in the garden flat. For 2 years since the applicant bought it, posters piled up. The garden is derelict. The fence has collapsed. He knew full well on purchase that the lease didn't allow for alterations, as he does not solely own the back of the house. However, he doesn't acknowledge the terms of the lease, refuses to accept the communal service charges or the decisions of this planning committee. The freeholders are currently taking legal action against him. The scale of this proposal remains totally out of proportion with the existing Victorian house, and I urge the committee to reject it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond. Mr. Richard Page. No? Oh. In that case, on to the... Would you have any comments?
One comment on that with respect in terms of the statements just made. I think there's a sort of wrapping up that all the issues were rejected by the inspector and this committee, whereas I think you need to separate the two. And I think that's quite clear in terms of the report. In terms of the size, bulk, etc., the inspector did not have any issues with that. The inspector did have an issue with the rear design of the extension. So I think it's maybe a little bit unfair to wrap that all up in one thing. You need to separate those out.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Councillor Lanning.
Thank you, Chair. How much wider is this extension than the host building?
Don't have that exact measurement. I mean, you can see it on the plans, and it's all I can say is this element that extends to the side is 300 millimetres wider than the previous proposal. Let me just see if I can get. You should be able to see it from the front of the property as well in a second. I mean, I would guess it's probably about just over a metre in width, wider than the actual dwelling. Now, the inspector did say previously the slightly narrower extension didn't have a significant impact on the conservation area. That was the conclusion, but of course this one is wider.
Can I check whether on page 81, at the bottom, it says the extension would be wider than the host building by approximately 0.8 metres. This is not an insignificant projection. Was that by the inspector who said that?
Yes, I believe that is the quote by the inspector, so therefore this one would be 1.1, as I said, just over a metre actually. That was a good guess.
Councillor D.
How many appeals have there been, and were they all dismissed?
As I said before, the report sets out the appeal that's been decided on the application and the reasons why it was refused. So there's been one appeal, I understand, unless I'm missing something in the history.
Just to have a different opinion on your information, you're correct that the appeal inspector said it had no issue in the conservation area, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because it also says that it has it's a dramatic difference to the house itself, and that's the major point, isn't it, here? So point 2 on page 87, I know people like using this English, it is not an insignificant projection. In plain English this is a significant projection.
I would go to the conclusion on those issues. That's a description of the development. And we have the conclusion that's set out in paragraph 4, 5 and 6 in the inspector's report. I mean, it's difficult to read into an inspector exactly what they were thinking at the time, but clearly the issue they were raising was the rear element of the extension being inappropriate in terms of design. That's how I would read what's been put out in that report. Obviously, I feel members may want to read it in a different fashion. That's absolutely fine as well.
Any further questions? Councillor Lanning?
I suppose just on that point, so on page 82, so I suppose the conclusion on paragraph 4, where the inspector says require proposals to respect the design and form of the original building, would that suggest that actually going outside of the original building, as it does, sort of 0.8 metres or what that is, wouldn't actually respect the original form of the original building?
Well, if I go back to paragraph 4 of the actual decision, it says, whilst the proposed extension would project beyond the side wall of the building, though that's the thing that's being considered, it is set well back from the front of the property and even further from the public footpath to the front of the site, such that views from the public domain of the building would be limited. As such, even though I have found that the proposal would harm the character and appearance of the host building, I consider it would not harm the overall character and appearance of the conservation area. Again, you can read into that what you want. I would interpret that as saying that it's not a particular issue because of the setback, otherwise it wouldn't have been mentioned. But again, I would emphasise what you're looking at this evening is not what was before the inspector. This is slightly higher and slightly wider.
Any further questions? On to comments. Councillor Dean.
Well, parallel universe going on here. Absolute parallel universe. I mean, I read this appeal, which is dismissed, point 11, for reasons given and having regard to all other matters raised, the appeal is dismissed. One of the matters is this is a significant projection, and it does affect the building, not the conservation area. So I think we've only heard half the story. I think one of the reasons most of us are councillors, because it's a miserable life being a councillor, is, Camber, you haven't done 13 years. The thing is that when you get applicants who refuse to accept what is right for this borough, what's right for the residents, and specifically what's right for the people here, and they go through different ways to push things through, we have to keep fighting that. We absolutely do. Because this is amazing. The first time it came, we roundly rejected it. The second time it came, I think we did the same thing. The appeal inspector absolutely has rejected it. He has not said one good thing about this. Because appeal inspectors are civil servants. They're not politicians. And they could say a lot of bad things, but they could have said a lot more good things, and they didn't. This is absolutely wrong. The residents here, the people who live above, will have a roof right outside their house. We rejected its height last time. Anybody living in that area will have something bigger than what was rejected by councillors and the inspector. We have to reject this for exactly the same reasons as we've done before.
Councillor Southgate.
Yes, I'd endorse that. I'm sorry, I was listening to something from the Edinburgh Festival of stand-up comedians before I came out, and were the applicant here, I'd be tempted to say, you're having a laugh, aren't you, mate? You know, it was refused before. He's made it 0.3 metres wider, 0.2 metres higher, 0.3 metres high just below the sill. So all of the reasons that the inspector gave previously would result in an unsympathetic addition that would appear to be out of character with the host building. We've got more so, you know? So just, I don't really see the logic of when you've been told that your extension is not fitting to the character of the host building, that you go and make it bigger and expect it to be accepted. The other point, the inspector did reject the argument that the occupants of flat 2 would be affected by the height of the sill. I think that argument comes back into contention because the sill has been raised, so the view from their window towards the garden will be further obstructed. Now, take advice from Mr. Milligan as to whether that is worth putting that reason back in for rejection, but certainly the impact on the host building has just been made worse by upscaling this extension.
Thank you. Any further comments? So, in terms of voting, I presume same reasons as last time. Same reasons as last time. Okay, so
yeah, same rooms is fine. Yeah.
Yes. Could we have a vote on that proposal, please? Do you have a seconder? Are you proposing or are you proposing? So Councillor Southgate proposing, Councillor Dean seconding. Yes? Those in favour? Favour of rejection?
Favour of rejecting.
Refusing it?
That's apart from yourself. That's
yeah.
fine.
Item 583 Dora Road.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's a relatively simple application, this one. Obviously, in terms of bolt scale, etc., the extension itself has been built. It wasn't built strictly in accordance with the planning permission. There has been some, I think what we would probably describe as minor adjustments to the proposal. As you can see, it's now been complete. If we just click onto these plans, you'll see the approved front elevation and the proposed front elevation, in other words, what's actually been built. You can see there's a reduced number of windows in the front elevation, but they are slightly larger. So you've got 2 instead of 4, but they're slightly larger. And also in terms of the garage, they've put a window into the garage instead of the garage there. Normally that would be permitted development in any event, so we don't have an issue with that. Side elevation, we've got a reduced number of windows. So again, no issue there. And the back of the property, Clearly, we had objections from neighbours in the first place about this particular development, but it was approved. So what we have now is, in terms of the approved rear elevation, is here we have a slightly adjusted rear elevation with less glazing. So you have on the first floor, that window now goes. On the ground floor, the window there also goes. So we have these two windows aligned. And the ground floor is actually slightly wider, but obviously that's ground floor level, which wouldn't cause any issues to the neighbours. So officers consider that the adjustments that have been made certainly don't make any significant difference in terms of impact on amenity, and it's recommended for approval.
Thank you. We have no speakers, so straight on to members' questions. Comments? Oh, question.
Could the officer explain what the point in having a planning committee is if we agree something and they build something different and you oppose it and you support it? What's the point in having this committee in that case?
Well, I think the reality is, in planning terms, we have to assess planning applications that come before us, as you know. In this particular case, what we have before us is it's been built that way. We have to present it back to you in terms of assessing its merits, etc. And if I was to look at the proposal previously and the proposal now, I'd probably prefer what's there now, actually. So therefore, we wouldn't be recommending approval for something that we don't have a particular issue with. But I do understand what you're saying in terms of the original intention. How someone would build something that deviates from an approved plan is not a risk I would personally take. But there we are.
Any further questions? Councillor Dehaney.
It's a little matter of the guttering, which you say that should be resolved during the construction stage. Paragraph 17, page 18. We know these things are very difficult to resolve after we approve the planning permission. Couldn't you? Why are you leaving it for?
We would never have that kind of detail in terms of a planning application, the specific, width or depth of guttering particularly. So that would normally be resolved with the neighbours, and it would be through a party wall act if necessary. But of course, you can't oversail your neighbouring properties with a gutter, and if you do, they can ensure that you have that removed if necessary. So if it is oversailing, then clearly there's an issue there, and that's a matter not for planning decision. It's a matter for the ownership issue between the neighbours. Not something we could get involved in, I'm afraid.
The trouble is, what I find that once we approve the development, the developer takes it as gospel, and he doesn't want to have any other changes to it at all. So, the neighbour has a little problem there.
Any further questions? Comments? Well, on to the vote. Those in favour? Those against? Not voting? Motion granted. Right. Item 10, appeals.
Obviously, it's an information item before you. I suppose there's the one case that I draw attention to is the former Sparrowhawk site. You may remember in terms of decision-making process, I believe it was recommended for approval by officers, actually. Members overturned it, and the appeal has been dismissed on character grounds in the area, so I thought I'd drop that to attention. The others are relatively minor in terms of the context of other applications.
Thank you. Item 11, enforcements.
Again, it's just an information item. If there's any particular issues, then you can raise direct with the team at any point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, all the agenda items being complete, I now officially close the meeting at 9:17. Thank you.